in some sense, you set a standard that I'm not going to match because I was not planning to introduce my fellow panelists at all because your staff has done such a great job of getting handsome pictures of each of us and giving a one-page version of that. And you guys can read faster than I can speak, so you can kind of scan that as you're going along if you don't know who each of us is. Shiva, Doug Shackelford, Lorene Maines, and Jim Giambavo. So that's who's here. And I think the purpose of this panel, as Peter explained it to me and then to us, is what can academic administration do to connect the faculty under whom, for whom they work, to more practical problems or more relevant or research issues. And so that's really the theme for this panel, is what levers exist at the dean's office to encourage more faculty at all levels to take on research topics that connect to practice. As we had our pre-conference discussion, which Peter monitored, we went through and got each of our perspectives that we'll be presenting in 6 or 7 minutes or less, so we have time for discussion after we finish. And then I mentioned that I had written a paper that captured what I said 2 years ago at the AAA conference, and so Peter said, well, why don't you send it? And it was his decision to duplicate it and distribute it to all of you. And Shiva said, I have a paper too, and so that was kind of the origin, that we seem to be the only two people in the day and a half of the conference to actually have papers. Now, just even though you had the paper, I'm not sure everyone bothered or got through to read it, but I wanted to just do this one component in my paper, because I actually think it's at the essence of what we're talking about here over the day and a half, of what does it really mean to connect research to practice. Sometimes we talk about that research should influence practice, and what we don't spend enough time talking about is how practice should influence research, okay? And so this is really bidirectional. Now, the traditional view of research is there's pure basic research just to get to fundamental understanding without any dollar sign or impact or relevance ringing in the background. Okay, we're just pursuing knowledge for knowledge's sake. And in a paper that described this, well, this goes back to Vannevar Bush in World War II. He talked about that. This is pure basic research, which the Academy does. He enabled this, Niels Bohr quadrant in quantum mechanics. But we can think of great scientists, such as those I've listed here, who have conducted fundamental research, and as it turned out, it's had an enormous impact on practice, but downstream. But that's not what they were thinking of, and that's not what motivated them. And then we think about applied research, and this is perhaps best exemplified by Edison, who is a great inventor, but not a great scientist. Okay? He was applying known science to come up with a whole series of amazing inventions, which we still benefit from today. But as I started to think about others in this area, or other inventions, something as transistor, which you might think was fundamental, is just basically applied quantum mechanics. It took 50, 60 years after quantum mechanics until we actually, Shockley and the Bell Labs people could create it. But it was an application of known physics, as is the laser. And that came in the 1960s again. And Steve Jobs, a brilliant inventor, but he's taking multiple technologies, multiple science disciplines to create devices that we all have learned to love and are impossible to do without. And in finance, something like credit default swaps is an application, again, of known financial economic principles. But the interesting quadrant, and this is the one that hadn't showed up before, is they call use-inspired research. So most of us have heard of Louis Pasteur. He was a chemist, and he was a professor at the University of Strasbourg. And if you have kind of a rough knowledge of the geography of France, you know there's some wonderful wine country not too far from Strasbourg in the Alsace region. And the local farmers, they were having a lot of trouble with the wine going bad. And so they went to Pasteur and said, you're a great scientist, can you figure out what's going on? And that's when he discovered, all the issues of microbiology and founded the whole discipline of microbiology. And subsequently went on to do similar work for the silkworm industry and the dairy industry. So this was fundamental science, as it turned out, but it was motivated and inspired by a problem that arose in practice. Can you solve this problem for us? And this is the part we don't see enough of, and this is really where the exciting things potentially could really be in our field. So I started to think about in management, do we have examples of use-inspired research? And I think the Hawthorne experiments done in the 1920s, founded the whole field of organizational behavior, looking at how you can change motivation and incentives for workers. Certainly the work done at Chicago in the 1960s, just trying to understand what's going on in the what came to be called the CRSP database, and then the development of asset pricing models kind of explain the phenomena that they were seeing in the databases. In the Black-Scholes work, options already existed, and they were being priced, but what mechanism did you have to price? So they didn't understand that, and so that led to Nobel Prize-winning invention. And the work of Tversky and Kahneman to study actually how do people make decisions under uncertainty is transformational in the way we think about it. So these were my examples. So I started to think about what does this mean for accounting? And I couldn't think of anything in the Bohr quadrant, but that's okay. We're a very applied discipline. Almost none of us does research for research's purpose. We do have an accounting profession out there, as we're learning over this day and a half. But we can, I think, identify areas where we've gone in and trying to understand issues in valuation. Started with Jim Olson, others have built on this, to come up with an accounting-based valuation as an alternative, and maybe a more practical alternative to discounted cash flow. And I think that's been adopted and widely used and now widely taught. Somewhat immodestly, I would say my own work in activity-based costing and the balanced scorecard came from knowing there was a problem in practice. Cost systems were inaccurate, financial measures were not a sufficient statistic for measuring the performance of organizations in short time periods. I started, and I did see in practice some innovations that really in effect solved that problem to my understanding of it, and I continue to work on that and elaborate on both those tools. And Bob Simons did similar work trying to understand the complexities of management control, which led to his work that 25 years ago of the multiple levers we have for control. So I think, I know I'm feeling good about our work, and we can feel good about these. But we've also done some very good applied research in accounting over the last 45 years. So we didn't invent the efficient markets hypothesis and theory, but we've done a great job in testing it and drawing out its implications for practice and for standard setting. And that's a triumph. We've applied principal agency theory, developed in economics, to CEO incentives and the design of those. Now, maybe the last 200 papers in this field were not as useful as the first 50 of these in this field, but nevertheless, this is progress. And just in my own work, and Peter mentioned this, I've taken the activity-based costing innovation and the newer version, time-driven, and working with Michael Porter in healthcare. So healthcare, you understand, in the US is a $3.5 trillion industry, 18% of GDP, and it's a sector that doesn't measure its outcomes and doesn't know its cost. And so we've been able to kind of go in there and put in fundamental measurement approaches to help that along. And it's not just a US issue. We're doing this in Europe, and more recently I'm doing this in Africa in the global health and public health arena. And so when you think about where your research can be in this applied, take on a sector like healthcare, where there's a huge gap in measurement, both outcomes and cost, 18% of GDP, this is what we would call a target-rich environment. If you can make progress there, this is people using, and they are using it. We have 24 papers at least published in this area, but they're not published in the accounting journals. We're publishing them in the healthcare journals or the medical journals, because they're the people who have to know about this. So one of the tests of whether your research is having an impact on practice is, can you publish it in their journals, not just in our accounting journals. Some of it we should publish in the accounting. Okay, so this is the Pasteur's quadrant. Why are we here? why are we here is there's a certain amount of angst in our academic accounting profession, but it's also in business schools. And I might say it's beyond us, it's in economics, as I document in the paper, that too much of our research is in this lower left-hand quadrant. It's not basic, and it's actually not very useful, as some of the practitioners described. And I thought, well, let me issue a challenge, because at our school, we have weekly seminars with many of you come and give papers, and your assistant professors and your doctoral students, and even our own doctoral students. And it seems that, and I was checking with Gerardo on this, probably at least 50% of the papers we've heard this year, and some of up to maybe as high as 70, when we got to research methodology, it says we're doing a difference in difference research design with fixed effects at the firm level, the industry level, and for time. As soon as I hear this, I'm in this lower left-hand quadrant. This research, you may be able to torture the data and tease out a t-statistic above 2 and get it published, but you're not telling me anything about the world. Because most of what's going on in the regression is in the fixed effects, which you haven't explained. You get a tiny incremental contribution that kicks the t-statistic up to 2.5, and you get a publication. Now, some of it I'm sure I'm oversimplifying, and the guys are going to yell at me. But I'm telling you, it's not really changing practice, and it's not helping us understand too much of practice. So let me kind of leave. So our challenge here, and this is what the purpose of the panel is what can we do? Potentially here is in the dean's office. Tomorrow you may hear from the journal editor's office to move our research at least to the easterly direction. And maybe we can encourage some to go northeast and come up with some fundamentally new ideas and new frameworks that will make the practice of accounting and the practice of management significantly better. So we're going to go in an order. There is kind of somewhat of a teaching plan of the order, but I'll leave that quiet for now. We'll have Shiva talk, because it turned out he and I were kind of thinking about things in kind of a similar way. And I must say I forgot to time myself. But I won't make that mistake with Shiva.
Oh, that's not
Come right here. That's all right. Just bring it down there. There you go. There you are.
Okay.
It's supposed to be a title. I don't know what happened. Anyway, so I've spent 2 years at the dean's office downstairs, and before I went down there, I thought I used to do interesting, important work. And the more time I spent downstairs, the less convinced I got about that assertion. So, a lot of what we do involves going to alums and raising money. And what I was shocked by was it's so difficult to raise money for the kind of work we do. Alums will write massive checks for school buildings, scholarships, anything to do with teaching and education, even perhaps to build a school gym before they finance some of what we do. And it's kind of disconcerting at some level. So that led me to think about, is there any natural market for what we do besides perhaps journals and maybe our peers? And the more I thought about that, the more I got worried. Because then I started asking these people, you've spent a lot of time out there in the real world, give me a couple of problems that you've not been able to solve. And they were all predictable problems, the difficult problems. Say, how do you value data? How do you measure culture? So if you're in the financial, if you're a fundamental analyst, how do you figure out, say, the fixed versus the variable cost structure of a company? How do you forecast something? Which is, for example, R&D. Most companies don't tell you what is R and what is D, and they're very different ideas. So basic stuff like that. How do you measure governance? How do you measure ESG impact? And then when you come back and look at, some of our journals, it's kind of hard to find answers to these questions. I found it even hard to find or assemble junior co-author teams to go and respond to some of these questions because half of them said, oh, it's too practical, it won't get published. The other half said, where's your exogenous shock, it won't get published. So it's kind of bizarre, how did practical stuff that people out there care about, senior practitioners who spent illustrious careers, how come that stuff is not publishable in our journals? To me, that still worried me a lot. So I went back and actually, being the empiricist that I am, I wanted to write down some falsifiable rules on how do I know whether or not we've had impact. And I came up with 3, and they may not be the best rules, but maybe you can add to that. So, for example, how many products and processes have we created in the last 50 years? Bob mentioned a few. If you go back and look at some of these CFO surveys, they usually list pain points, stuff that CFOs worry about, stuff that keeps them up at night. And then you can go back 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and try to correlate that with what shows up in our journals. The correlation, frankly, is modest at best. And the third idea, and this is from computer science, and I work a lot with engineering, and that's why I've been influenced quite a bit by some of the stuff they do. Computer science has had this last generation of advisors. They can't PhD students can't find people to work with because they're all working for either Google or Uber or Microsoft or something. So is the know-how in academia somehow ahead of practice? And if you look at, say, medicine and engineering, by and large, this is true. I'm not too sure about accounting. And then again, being the accountant that I am, you get to actually look at the income statements of the school. And if you run some basic numbers, the average, not average, actually, a top-tier accounting publication costs the school anywhere between $200,000 to $400,000. And unless you're Yale or Harvard and you have a big endowment, most of it comes from tuition. So this leads to the other issue. This is a big number. So if you're a celebrity professor in one of our, in a school, and you write a book, your book advance may be in the $300,000 range. So we're effectively writing a check for a book advance for every paper that gets published in one of the top journals. So you have to wonder, what is the ROI? ROI to whom? These are like awkward questions. I don't necessarily have answers to these, and I just document my thought process and my intellectual journey through these questions in the paper. So anyway, not to get too down on the whole idea. So how do you move forward? So, there are 2 schools on campus that we can potentially use as role models, both engineering and medicine. So how are they different? The way they finance research is different. In engineering, around 9 months of your salary gets paid out of tuition. For the other 3 months, you have to go convince somebody, either a company or a grant-giving agency, to write you a check, which means you have to actually sell them on your research idea, which I think is kind of a useful discipline to have. In medicine, if you're an academic doctor, you spend something like 40-50% of your time talking to patients. So you get invaluable feedback about stimulus response, something that we don't have, and we should try and build some mechanisms to get to that idea. So, and then this also leads to interesting questions about where does corporate R&D and university R&D fit in the broader scheme of things. So again, if you look at engineering, by and large, the universities come up with a prototype, and once the prototype is ready for production, they send it off to corporate R&D. Something similar in medicine. How I don't quite understand how, say this huge market for corporate advice, the McKinseys and the Bains, how do they coexist with us? What do they do? Do they use some of what we do? Maybe not. Should they? I don't know. We can discuss these issues. So moving forward, and this is going to be a very long journey, as tuition becomes harder, at least at the smaller institutions, I think we have no choice but to think about some kind of soft money, maybe move to the engineering model, go convince somebody to actually write you a check to work on some of these things, or build mechanisms to create this feedback loop that medicine has, which is, I think, wonderful, that a lot of us don't have, which I think also makes us sterile, makes us write papers about average cross-sectional stuff. People in the real world have a very hard time with cross-sectional stuff. The first comment you hear is that my firm is not average. Why do I care about average? So there are all these issues. I mean, I have like a 50-page paper, and hopefully it's not a difficult read. So it would be nice if you read it. Feedback and criticism welcome. So this is just the beginning of a conversation. Thank you. Thank you.
Perfect. Right on time. Doug?
So I didn't write a paper, but I would recommend both Bob and Shiva's paper. And Shiva's paper has a question in it. It says, will deans start by means of baby steps to condition rewards and pay raises, or just celebrate a faculty member's ability to demonstrate impact of their research on practice or policy? And I thought, since I'm in my 6 years as dean and baby steps are about what I can reasonably expect at this stage in my life, I would try to answer that question by talking about what we're doing actually at UNC. I'm going to, the first thing I can say is we had an alum a few years ago who gave us some money for an annual prize for faculty members who did research that had practical or policy impact. We try to make a big deal about that. It seems to not be terribly important to our faculty. I don't know if $10,000 isn't enough, or the wine's not good enough at the dinner, but we have similar awards that seem to generate a lot more cultural impact in the school. I think our faculty care a lot more about getting a non-practical, non-policy-oriented APUB. And so that's one thing that hasn't moved the needle for us. But having said that, there are some things that are changing in our school, and we may be an exception to the rule, or we may be similar to some of your places. Most of these things are actually happening outside of accounting, but I think they're relevant to what we're discussing here, and I think they're relevant to accounting. I'm going to be a little opaque in the way I describe them because a couple of them involve tenure cases, but I think you'll be able to follow what went on. So some years ago, we had a tenure case that came forward out of one of our departments. It was unanimously supported by every tenured faculty member in the school. And it went to the provost. The provost, let's just say the provost was from the chemistry department. The provost actually wasn't from the chemistry department, but for purposes of this, that's the way we'll describe it. And the provost said, this person's CV looks like a poor member of the chemistry department. The publications are what a poor chemist would do. And so I see no reason we would tenure a poor chemist in the business school. And we really struggled to make a case for why we were tenuring a person in the business school who was doing discipline-based research. Now, eventually, we relied upon the fact, well, there are other faculty at really good business schools who wrote very positive letters about this person, and the provost's response was, then there's lousy chemists in other business schools. And that wasn't totally compelling either. This person eventually got through, but soon left, because you can imagine the controversy arising when your provost doesn't want you, even if your school wants you. And it led to a substantial change in the direction of that particular department. And over about a year of sort of who do we want to be when we grow up, that department settled on only managerial relevant, and that was a term they used, research would hereafter be counted as quality by that group. And over the last decade or so, that group has made a compelling case for attracting strong faculty. The group's stronger now than it was when that case went through, by only taking in people who meet their standard for managerial relevant research. Now, they may be viewed as a bit of a renegade in academic quarters, but they've had a real impact on other departments within our school. Now, I'll tell you how crazy things get. There was another department in our school that decided they would follow the first department's approach. So we had a tenure case come up where a faculty member got a very mixed review from that second department. And the case went forward without my support, and the provost tried to overturn that case to get that person tenured. This was a different provost. The argument there was, well, there's all these experts in the business school community who think that this chemist is outstanding. So what makes you think that your faculty should not tenure this person? So in other words, this faculty member was doing work that the group did not determine to be managerial relevant, but they were contributing to a discipline outside of what that group thought was managerial relevant. That was a bloody fight, but eventually that case went down. Recently, two of the most highly influential chaired faculty and yet a third department in our school have put forward that the standard for our school should be managerially relevant research across all departments, and that no one should be tenured at UNC unless they meet that standard. We're in the midst of trying to sort out what that means. So maybe our whole school is going to go renegade, I don't know. This isn't the kind of decision that a dean makes because it's a cultural decision that a faculty has got to sign on altogether, but I can give you the pros and cons of it. Here's the group that's arguing for that. We are on research is not on a sustainable path. The tuition pays the bills. Competition for the primary source of our tuition, MBA students, is increasing. That pool is shrinking. And ultimately, students are going to want a school where the faculty research, teach, and know something about the things that managers care about. They don't want to have faculty who are chemists. They want to have faculty who are actually knowledgeable about accounting, finance, marketing, operations, et cetera. And if we continue to hire, promote, et cetera, chemists because they get a lot of pubs and the right journals, but they can't do the accounting, finance, operations, marketing, et cetera, we will ultimately be punished by the market for students. My time up?
It's getting there, yeah.
All right. I'll give you the cons and then I'll yield. The cons is, so how do you actually do this? Who becomes the judge of what's managerially relevant? What does quality and quantity mean? Thank you for that kind moment. You know, will we actually turn down a person with an extraordinarily long, strong CV just because they're not managerially relevant? Will we actually profit in the market for talent, or we just run off all our good assistant professors? Are we returning to a trade school? And is this really a way to justify getting rid of researchers and saving money by going to adjuncts? I don't know, but we're in the midst of that discussion at UNC.
Thanks, Doug. So we still want to come back how at least one or two of those departments.
Thanks, Bob. I want to follow up on some of the things that Doug mentioned. And I guess I see them as positive news, and maybe I'm coming from my perspective that most of the research I have done, I've hoped has been informed by practice and has some information for practice. But I do think there's a shift in the environment these days that makes this more important for schools. And Doug talked about decreasing tuition dollars. I mean, it's also just the cost of education, and deans and provosts are under a lot more pressure about not just what are you doing for my individual students, and that usually means getting a job, but if you're doing research and that's what tuition dollars are paying, what is it doing for society? What is it doing for someone? And you see a lot more grand challenge projects now where schools are taking on multidisciplinary, big issues, health-related issues, opioid challenges, things like that. So you see schools putting a lot more of their research dollars in that, and I think that just reflects the more emphasis on something that's relevant to practice, to society. So, you know, I guess I see that somewhat as good news. So the talk, anyway, is more in that direction than I think ever before. Now, the question is, and this gets to a number of things that Doug happened to mention, are we walking the talk? And those of you who are pre-tenure probably just about had a heart attack listening to Doug. And that's one thing we have to do as deans or associate deans or provost is make sure the messages that we give to you are going to be followed up down the road in the tenure process. Now, I don't see these things as dichotomies. I don't see here's practice relevant research and it's not rigorous, or it's rigorous research. I don't see those as the ends of two extremes at all. You know, you can look, for example, the AAA, the Wildman Award, and look at the names, and there's many people in this room who, or a number of people anyway, who have won that award, who have very rigorous research that was deemed to be very relevant to practice. So I think it's somewhat of a false dichotomy to try to say you have to be one or the other. The other thing I would remind people of is you've got a long career here. This is not just, your time from now till tenure is short and is a very small part of your career. So even if you're worried about, oh, this may not get me tenure, down the road, you've got the freedom to do a lot more. You've got the freedom to explore different avenues. And so I would encourage people to think about that. What can we do to help in addition? You know, one thing I think is to help you interact with the practitioners. Particularly if you are at a public school, the Big Four are probably there all the time. I think they are there more than sometimes I am at the Kelley School of Business. So there should be, if you are interested in auditing research or financial reporting, you should have access to all kinds of practitioners. Alumni databases should be deep, and there should be abilities to connect you with alumni who generally love to talk to the faculty. I would say other things to explore are perhaps if you have centers or institutes, either within the school or within the university. Those tend to be often multidisciplinary, but they often bring together groups of academics and practitioners talking around issues, maybe data analytics, maybe healthcare, issues like that we can connect you with. And I would just, I guess one thing I would say that I would encourage people, and maybe this is just my view of thinking about research, but I always start with, you know, who's the decision maker here? What's the decision setting? Why does anybody care about what I'm doing? And maybe this comes from me being an experimentalist, and that's very much how we're trained to think of things. I would encourage people, regardless of, you know, what your method may be. This shows, you know, we've been talking about this question for decades. I actually went back and noticed that I was on a panel with Denny Barris for 25, 30 years ago. We were talking about this. I think it's healthy that we're still talking. But one paper that I wanted to point to that kind of has this framework set up about the decision maker, the decision setting, is actually a paper by Sarah Bonner, which ended up in her book. It's the first chapter of her book, but it's a 1999 Accounting Horizons paper that I think takes people through a framework that would be helpful in terms of thinking about practice-relevant research.
Okay. Well, I want to start by saying that I appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel and that my thinking about the relevance of financial accounting research has been impacted by the articles by Bob Kaplan, Reverse the Curse of the Top 5, and by Shiva, Integrating Practice into Accounting Research. And I also appreciate the comments of Doug and Lauren. And if they believe there's a disconnect between the research published in the leading accounting journals and the needs of practice, then we ought to sit up and pay attention. I think we all agree, and this has already been said, that we can do a better job informing practice, and that's going to require that we meet more frequently with practitioners to understand the problems they face and making our research more accessible to practitioners. But it also may be the case that practitioners need to be more aggressive in processing research studies to understand what we're doing. If you look at the SEC, there are a number of PhDs working for the SEC. I think there's only about 5 that have PhDs in accounting. If you look at the Financial Accounting Standards Board, what are there, two or three PhDs at the Financial Accounting Standards Board? How many do you think are at the Fed? Over 200 people in finance and economics. So, you know, it's nice that we care about disseminating research, but I don't think, you know, on the other side, that there is an aggressive action being taken to understand that research, certainly not as much as there is at the Fed. And while I believe we can do a better job conducting, that's not 7 minutes, Bob.
That was for me.
Okay. Thank you, Lauren.
You can have some of my time.
Okay, you didn't like where I was going with this. So now, well, I believe we can do a better job conducting research that's informed by practice. I'm not as pessimistic as some of my colleagues about the current state of affairs. And part of this because, you know, we're as faculty members, we teach practice day in, day out. And then we do research. I can't understand why there'd be this big dichotomy where we love to teach practice and then we don't want to do research that's going to impact practice. And also when I look back over the years, I think there's quite a bit that we've learned from accounting research that's relevant. I mean, it's certainly, I like it, so I'll take you on this is like a 1-minute journey. Go back to Feltham and Dembski, and they were talking about what's the role of information? It's decision influencing and it's decision facilitating. That's important to know as you start thinking about standards in accounting and how they're going to affect contracting as well as the value of the firm. As a first order of approximation, we know that publicly available accounting information is quickly reflected in prices. But due to systematic errors in processing information, there are cases where publicly available information can be used to earn abnormal returns. We know that agency problems lead managers to manipulate earnings, and the manipulation may be cash flows and it may be accruals. We've learned how to value firms using a residual income model, and we've learned the equivalence of that residual income model to a cash flow model. We've learned about the impact of institutional investors on the pricing of information. We've learned about how fair regulation, fair disclosure affected information provided to analysts. And in a paper by Lutzi Hale and Christian Lutz, who are with us today, we learned that a cross-country securities regulation is related to the cost of capital. I think that's a very powerful finding and a very encouraging finding, much like what we see in finance, where they've done research on the rule of law and how that's affected economies over the years. So many of you know I've been dean for 14 years, and you're saying, hey, these are really old research studies, Jim. How about something a little newer? And as dean, I barely get past abstracts, but I have read a couple of abstracts. I'm just going to mention a few papers that I think are very useful. The first is by Weili Gee, Allison Koester, and Sarah McVeigh in JAE, which quantifies the costs and benefits of exempting firms from audit or oversight of internal control under Section 404B. And importantly, they find that cost to shareholders of not having the oversight outweighs the benefits defined by audit cost savings. A second paper was published in JAE by two guys whose names I can barely pronounce, so let's see if I can do this. One is, they're both at Berkeley, Yaniv Konchitsky and Panos Padatokis. And their work shows that aggregate accounting earnings growth can be used as a leading indicator of growth in GDP, and that macro forecasters do not fully incorporate this information. I mean, we're really interested in forecasting GDP. And finally, a paper by Suresh Nalareddy and Maria Ogneva in the Accounting Review shows that a simple aggregation of accounting information, earnings growth dispersion, can predict future restatements in macroeconomic estimates, including GDP growth and the change in unemployment. And these macro indicators are closely watched by policymakers and investors, so improving the measurement of the indicators seems like a very useful exercise. So obviously this isn't a random or complete set of useful research articles, but I think they're good exemplars of the valuable research being conducted today. And what do they all have in common? They were all published in leading academic journals. And I'll quickly end by saying I don't think there's going to be less emphasis in the near term on articles in the leading journals. The top researchers in the field, that's where they publish their research. Junior faculty, they want to follow in their footsteps. And while publication in a top journal is a noisy signal of quality, I believe it's still a useful signal. Now, having said that, counting top publications clearly shouldn't be the only evaluation in the P&T process. We need input from fellow faculty who have carefully read the candidate's work and input from distinguished scholars who are outside our college who are familiar with the candidate's research. And that, I believe, is what happens at virtually all major business schools. So with that, I'm looking forward to questions, comments, and protests from the audience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Okay, let's open it up.
This morning, you're almost asking for a new journal that takes some of the articles that are in some of our top tier journals that are in academic code and asking for the academics to rephrase it in practitioner code so that the practitioners can then synthesize that information better.
Yeah. Well, let me just
but-
say, all practitioners have their own journal. It's hard to think of any group of practitioners that doesn't have several journals.
I agree.
And so
But-
those already exist, and if it has an impact and they value it, you should be able to publish in those journals. We don't need a
But
new
right now,
journal.
there's no value, at least at most institutions, from the deans.
Well, that's a
publishing in
separate story.
those-
That's a self-inflicted wound, not a structural problem. But, so, okay,
Well, so do you think these practitioner journals would value basically having just issues that are taking some of the articles that are in the academic journals and restating them? And currently auditing journal, right? They do that. They have the issues current issues in accounting research or whatever that is, where they take the articles published in auditing and recast them to the practitioners.
yeah, go.
So translations are useful, but in our experience, at least our alums don't read translations. Because when you write translations, you're solving a problem you care about, not what they care about. That's the problem with translations.
But I'm not sure, I would say I don't agree with that. I think, I come back with what Jim is saying. A lot of our articles do look at things that are of interest to management, but we don't do a very good job of explaining that.
No, I agree with you. Translations are useful in their own right, but don't expect translations by themselves to solve the problem. I think the issue is production, not translation, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I have a sort of a similar view in the following sense. Academics have no incentive to do what you are suggesting. Don't expect it. However, I am suggesting what the CFA Institute has done, whether they still do it or not, I'm not sure. The CFA Institute administers the CFA exam. It publishes the Financial Analyst Journal. And it used to have what is called the CFA Digest. What is the CFA Digest? There is an editor, okay, and this is a practitioner editor, not an accounting editor, not an academic. A practitioner editor who determines what papers are relevant to practitioners, writes them in a way that can communicate to practitioners. Notice that academics won't do either one of these things, okay? They can't write in a way to communicate to practitioners. Number two, they're not going to write because it's not worth their time. They're not going to be compensated. Much of what we're doing is hiding our light under a barrel. And we have to get it out at a minimum cost to us, because we're not going to do it. So, and if it does benefit the practitioners, perhaps the AICPA would consider doing such a thing, just like the CFA Institute did. That's my
So
suggestion.
let me go up to you, Doug, because you're saying there's no incentives. What I heard you is there's an emerging incentives going on at UNC. And so what I question, what are the criteria? How do they make that judgment that a piece of research is or is not managerially relevant? Because this will be at the heart of whether we can make progress here.
Yeah, so the discussions we've had have been things like this. Does this paper answer any questions that students are asking, practice is asking, policymakers are asking, or does it provide information that would change the things that students would learn, that practice would act upon, that policymakers would do? Those sorts of things. Does that audience care?
So that discussion in the tenure appointments committee or the
That's right.
subcommittee
So
is trying to answer that
that's
question.
right. So you got 10 publications and someone's going to work through it and say, these 7 do that, these 3 don't. So these 3 are going to be discounted in some way.
So I look at the slide talking about how engineering needs to convince someone to write a check to finance their research, and then medicine, they get the instant feedback loop. The concern is that when you have alumni or organizations writing checks, that we're not unbiased in our research endeavors, right? We're going to start producing products that substantiate what they want ex ante. And that's kind of the concern with social science, because I think, as an accounting academic, a lot of our research kind of sometimes points out the things that maybe audit firms don't want to hear, or the SEC doesn't want to hear, or those types of things. So how can we go to that type of model while also maintaining our independence and our mind and all that?
I think you're underselling your alumni base. We run this we run this process that Shiva describes twice a year at Harvard Business School, where the 5-year reunion classes come back, and we have faculty that are just talking about their research to them. And actually, we get very good feedback that each weekend. And it's not that we're doing things that they want to hear. They want to hear, are the faculty at this school doing interesting work that's going to change management practice? They don't have a preconceived notion of what that is going to be, but they're excited that where they had their alma mater, there are faculty working on problems that cause people in practice to think differently and better about their field. And that's not a bad criteria to respond to, is to ask faculty, not every year, once 5 years, to talk to your alumni and tell us what you're working on and tell us how people may change behavior, do things differently as a result of what you're working on.
That sounds a little bit different than the way it was conveyed, I guess, in the slide of, in some ways trying to convince somebody to finance this project as opposed to just having a casual
so we
conversation.
get funding in this indirect, but still very useful way.
Yeah, so it's my slide, maybe I should respond. So a couple of comebacks here, right? So you're right, sponsored research has problems. We've seen that in the world of medicine, right? But a lot of us, I'm guessing, are going to live longer because of what medicine created. There's always a cost and a benefit to whatever model. Money is not free. Tuition doesn't just fall out of the sky. So, yes, you're right. I mean, there are issues, but there are ways to handle them as well. Does everybody have to do this? No, there can be some kind of combination of some tuition-based and some sponsored work. That's what engineering does.
So I want to push back a little bit on what I think is Jim already sort of, I think, made some excellent points in this direction, but I want to make them in a sort of more direct way, given that Shiva was using medicine as an example. So what I want to push back on is this notion that somehow our quest for causality and trying to be more rigorous in the research, that somehow is at conflicts with either the research being relevant to practitioners or regulation. Take evidence-based medicine, right? This is one of, if you ask medicine researchers and practitioners, they'll say this is one of the top 10 things we've ever done in medicine. It's up there with antibiotics and other medical inventions in the BMJ when they rank sort of what were the top inventions. Now, how did it come about? It came about by a concerted effort by researchers that realized that one of the critical things we needed was RCTs and causality in order to provide recommendations and advice to practitioners. Now, in many settings, you cannot provide or you cannot produce an experiment because in some cases it would be unethical, in other cases it's just not feasible. So take the link, and other people heard me say that before, between health outcomes and alcohol. Right? There, you can't do a randomized experiment. It would be sort of unethical. So we have hundreds of studies on this issue. People in this literature had produced evidence that looked like it was a good thing, and I was very happy about that, to drink 2 glasses of alcohol at night or wine because it would have positive health outcomes. When people studied this more carefully and they started using fixed effects and some of the things that we're using and thinking about selection, we realized that in the abstainer group, there were people in there that had good reasons to abstain. And once you adjusted for the abstainers in the selection, you got something that looked less favorable, which is a linear line basically saying there are risks associated with drinking alcohol. So the point being, I think, in many of the cases where we want to go to the SEC or we want to go to the practitioners saying, hey, certain things that we found out has consequences, we need to be sure that these things actually have this causal link. And so in my mind, it's a false dichotomy to kind of tell people that the research doesn't have to be rigorous, because otherwise I think we're going to go in the direction of storytelling.
So I also, as you know, as I was saying, work in the healthcare, and there's no question that that's an important part of healthcare. But the set of healthcare issues that can be addressed by the randomized clinical trials is fairly narrow. And even with the advent of evidence-based medicine, when we look across healthcare institutions, we find 10-to-1 variations in both the outcomes and at least 3-to-1 variations in the cost associated with producing those outcomes. And when you start to think about how to change healthcare delivery, not just do you use alcohol or not, or you use this device or that device or this drug or that drug, which lends itself very well to randomized clinical trials, as you try to make improvements in healthcare delivery, and this now is their equivalent of management accounting and some financial, it's just not possible to do that. I mean, you can do it longitudinally. I mean, you take an intervention and a set of practices and you see what the impact has been. And it's not large sample, but it's small sample, and it goes directionally correct, and you get an estimate of the magnitude. And part of the issue I have is persuading some of these editors of the journals who have now grown up in that field, that they should also allow these other, what they now call quality improvement papers, based on actual field work to change the way you organize the delivery of medical care, treatment by condition by condition. And they should coexist, and that's the problem. We need to have a coexistence here. And what's happening is the rigorous causality is driving out some research that actually will inform and improve practice in ways that over time will be verifiable and testable.
Just so that one point that we're not misunderstanding, I'm not pushing that we should all be doing RCTs, because as you point out, that's not feasible. But the push towards diffs and fixed effects and all the methods are basically recognizing that in many cases we cannot experiment, but if we want to make causal statements, then we need to have these quasi-experimental features in place so that we can make these kind of statements, right?
Yeah, but we should do a retrospective analysis of how many of the papers using that methodology are turning up results that have any kind of insight or impact for practice, as opposed to showing I exercise the methodology in a coherent, correct way. And I think that's the test that Doug is saying. Let's look at these papers and see who, that's great, that's a good result. Does anyone care about this? And why should they care about it? And that's another, we should be able to ask that question as well. Not just that we executed the methodology well. Is that? Yeah. But no, this is an important discussion and dialogue for us to be having.
So I sort of like the quadrant framework that you put up there. We would probably disagree somewhat about which studies should go in which quadrants, what things make a paper, sort of better for practice versus better for generating knowledge. But I do agree that there are papers that find themselves in that lower left quadrant, and that's something that as a field we should be sort of committed to rooting out to whatever extent we can. But what I wanted to ask about was to what extent you think this is a uniquely accounting problem? Because my guess would be, right, we're immersed in the accounting literature, we see a bunch of papers published in top journals that we maybe think, oh, in retrospect, not the biggest paper, not the best design, not the most impactful. But we're immersed in accounting. We probably are just unaware of all the papers published in top physics journals, top chemistry journals, top biology journals, right? There's probably tons of these papers as well that were done by very good scientists, done with the best intentions, that just never ended up having an impact on those fields. And of course, we just would never become aware of such a paper because we're not immersed in those fields. I guess, yeah, I'm just wondering if you could shed light on to what extent you think this is uniquely
It's not in
accounting.
accounting at all. I mean, the Pasteur's quadrant idea came out of engineering, because they feel that not enough of the engineering faculty, even though they're getting the funding, are working on problems that actually make a difference or discovering science. And the discussions on the journal impact factor are coming out of the life sciences. It's actually the people in life sciences and medicine who are complaining about the pressure on just getting into a few journals and how that's distorting the research agenda of the young people in those fields. So that's a partial or complete answer to that question. I didn't make that stuff up. I was reading what these people had done.
So I wrote this up, keeping accounting in mind because it's easier to be self-critical. A lot of the other fields have the exact same problem. Corporate finance has a similar issue. If you look at marketing, this should be the golden age of marketing research in terms of data. But a lot of if you go look at the number of people working on data in a typical marketing department, it's not a whole lot. Management, by and large, takes psychology and sociology work and tries to generalize that, I don't know, based on some loose generalization to how CEOs actually function in the workplace. In fact, it's actually seen as a sign of strength if you go and publish in sociology and psychology. So it is by no means just an accounting problem. I mean, I don't know enough about the sciences as much as Bob does, but it's a business school-wide problem. And I just didn't want to take on 6 disciplines. So that's why I wrote this up as accounting.
And to build on that, 3 examples I gave were not in our accounting department.
Yeah, this is at least a business school issue. But again, where I got the idea of the curse of the top 5, that was an economics panel staffed by Nobel Prize winning economists. And they specified 90-minute session at their session because they had to be concerned about it. And it was Jim Heckman who led that panel. Very extraordinary research with enormous impact. And so anyway, academic disciplines in general are feeling this angst. And it's going to happen at the university, and you talked about the pressure on funding, because the feeling is, what are we getting from this huge investment in research that we're doing across the university? Where your tuition is going up at several percentage points above the CPI for the last 50 years. So that's the accountability that we have to face to society on this.